The legend of Azor Ahai is clearly one of the most explored aspects of lore in the world of Ice and Fire. And although the interest in this myth far outstrips the actual presence and importance of the tale within A Song of Ice and Fire itself, it's not hard to understand why it has caught the attention of so many fans. Azor Ahai is supposedly the hero who came to end the first long night, and now that the long night seems to be coming again, questions about who this generation's Azor Ahai might be have become a key to unraveling the entire story in the eyes of many readers. And it is entirely possible that Azor Ahai is just as important as so many people seem to think. But there are some other narrative components to this legend and the way that it is framed within the mainline story, as well as the expanded World of Ice and Fire materials, that can likely give some clarity about the real lesson that should be learned through this myth. And one of the most overlooked but likely relevant aspects of this story is not the hero, but the sacrifice. Because clearly Azor Ahai is seen as the central figure in this ancient saga, which is understandable because that is the focal point every time that we hear the tale told. However, Nissa Nissa's existence and her death is oftentimes overlooked as nothing more than a turning point where Azor Ahai's determination to end the long night became his ability to end the long night. But Nissa Nissa is more than a point of demarcation in the story of this ancient legend. As a character and individual, Nissa Nissa is all but forgotten. She is simply the catalyst by which Azor Ahai creates Lightbringer. She is the ultimate sacrifice that he makes in service of a supposed greater good. But there is something very interesting about that narrative spin, because we've certainly repeatedly seen that ritual sacrifice is a means to a kind of mystical power that is inaccessible otherwise. But the framing of Nissa Nissa's death as Azor Ahai's sacrifice is a strange one. It is her life that is ending. She is the one who is quite literally losing everything. But it is her husband's willingness to kill her in exchange for power that makes him into the supposed hero that he becomes. That alone should make the entire framing of this myth extremely questionable. Azor Ahai is characterized as the hero who ends the eternal darkness that has consumed the world. But if you remove the legendary aspect of this narrative and think it through in very human, mundane terms, the notion that any person who would willingly kill the one they love most in exchange for world-dominating power is a hero seems basically impossible. On the contrary, if you ignore the fact that Azor Ahai is literally referred to as a hero, then what he does in order to create Lightbringer sounds far more like a villain origin story than a heroic origin story. Although this is a bit of an alternative view on Azor Ahai as a mythical figure, it's certainly not unique or a particularly shocking conclusion to come to. After all, the name Lightbringer is an extremely direct reference to the literal Christian devil. So it's not beyond belief that this supposed ancient hero and his contemporary reincarnation are actually going to reap great destruction on the world that they're meant to save. Unsurprisingly, my opinion on who Azor Ahai actually is, given this caveat that he's a baddie, probably isn't a popular idea, but it still seems the most plausible. In all likelihood, Daenerys Targaryen is this world's new version of Azor Ahai, as she has already sacrificed the man that she loved in exchange for fiery superweapons whose heat comes from within. Which again, doesn't make Azor Ahai's myth seem particularly inspiring and heroic. Because yes, when Daenerys kills Drogo, she genuinely believes that she loves him, to the point that she's willing to die for him. But from an external vantage point, she is essentially a tween with overwhelming Stockholm Syndrome, who is mourning the loss of her adult rapist and is willing to do anything to bring him back to life, so he can rape and pillage his way to the Iron Throne for her and their son. Clearly, I don't think any tears should be shed for the loss of Drogo. Nor do I think that this is a particularly good sign that Dany and her dragons will have a net positive impact on Planetos. However, I do think there is some interesting meat to be explored here, in that I don't think any characters are actually preordained to do anything. So while I do think Dany will be Azor Ahai reborn, and I do think that Azor Ahai is a baddie, the way in which this prophecy comes to pass is worth considering. I do think that Dany will ultimately have to choose it, but I also think that she will be pushed in that direction by outside forces, namely, by the followers of R'hllor. It again doesn't seem to be a coincidence that Azor Ahai and the faith of R'hllor are so deeply connected within the story, and the presumption that a bunch of fanatics who feel more akin to a doomsday cult than a traditional religion believe that Daenerys is Azor Ahai reborn because she's meant to save the world in a traditional sense seems like a misfire. The fact that Bonero has been preaching that Dany is the hero of their faith says a lot, and what he actually thinks she's meant to do is even more telling. In A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion 6, Bonero is mentioned for the first time. Bonero has sent forth the word from Volantis. Her coming is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. From smoke and salt was she born to make the world anew. She is Azor Ahai returned, and her triumph over darkness will bring a summer that will never end. Death itself will bend its knee, and all those who die fighting in her cause shall be reborn. Further on in the chapter, Bonero's beliefs are punctuated even more clearly. In Volantis, thousands of slaves and freedmen crowd the temple plaza every night to hear Bonero shriek of bleeding stars and a sword of fire that will cleanse the world. He has been preaching that Volantis will surely burn if the Triarchs take up arms against the Silver Queen. Obviously, Bonero's expectations for Daenerys aren't particularly unclear, nor do they sound remotely heroic. Ironically, the "all those who die fighting in her cause shall be reborn" portion of the text makes this literally sound like the same apocalypse that we're expecting from the others. And a sword of fire that will cleanse the world and Volantis surely burning also don't have very positive vibes. But Bonero's beliefs about what Dany is meant to do aren't fact. They aren't set in stone. They merely indicate what he and his followers, like Makoro, will be pushing her toward. If she does ultimately fulfill this prophecy, burn cities to the ground, and kill hundreds of thousands in the process, that will irrefutably be her choice. However, it'll be interesting to see if it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Clearly the belief that she is Azor Ahai reborn is already influencing how the followers of R'hllor see her, which will therefore affect how they try to influence her and will likely alter how she starts to see herself. So, if Azor Ahai has a lot of villain coding within his prophecies and origin stories, and if Daenerys has more obvious indications that she is Azor Ahai reborn than anyone else, what actually makes this myth even worth discussing? Going back to the very essence of the legend, the difference between seeing Azor Ahai as a hero or a villain comes down to framing. And there is something else that sticks out about the framing of Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa. Interestingly, although Azor Ahai's legend is briefly covered in the world of Ice and Fire, Nissa Nissa is not. This figure, known by other names like Eldrick Shadowchaser or Hercune the Hero, and his sword Lightbringer are both mentioned in this lore. But Nissa Nissa and the entire creation myth of Lightbringer is not included. Nissa Nissa only gets a few mentions in A Song of Ice and Fire, and all instances where she is named are related to Stannis and the people around him. Similarly, although Azor Ahai does warrant more references throughout the books, the vast majority of them are focused around Stannis, despite the fact that many theorize that characters like Jon or Daenerys are far more likely to be the prophesied pseudo-savior. In fact, it is arguably a bit of a foregone conclusion that whoever Azor Ahai may be, it is decidedly not Stannis. So then, what is the point of constantly coming back to this story in Stannis' orbit? Within the folk tale itself, Nissa Nissa's death feels like a tragedy. Because even if she is a non-entity outside of her husband, clearly the reason Lightbringer is imbued with so much power is because Azor Ahai loved her more than anyone. But within the context of Dany as Azor Ahai, this becomes conceptually very interesting. Because again, she does love Drogo, but their relationship is horrific and the world is almost certainly an objectively better place without Drogo in it. He is responsible for an incalculable number of deaths. The people he victimized, who managed to survive, would undoubtedly spit on his grave. And even his Dothraki followers simply move on and follow the new person with power once he's dead. It's not beyond belief that Daenerys is literally the only person alive who was even sad to see Drogo die. And she is only sad because she is an emotionally damaged child who rationalized away her own trauma and is rightfully terrified that losing Drogo means losing the power and safety that came along with being his wife. And that makes him a very bizarre sacrifice within the analogous context of Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa. As a fable, the story of Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa seemingly has a simple lesson, that great power requires great sacrifice. At least within Dany's own mind, the death of Drogo was a huge sacrifice that she didn't want to make. But his end led to her gaining the greatest power in the entire world. But again, we see the legend of Azor Ahai through the story of Stannis most of all. Melisandre is obsessed with the idea that Stannis is Azor Ahai reborn, and it seems like Stannis is beginning to believe it. And at the core of this myth is that concept, that in order to gain the greatest power, it is required to make the greatest sacrifice. Azor Ahai tries to forge Lightbringer twice before succeeding, but the only thing that gives the sword its strength is killing Nissa Nissa with it. And the way in which this is going to affect Stannis' trajectory seems obvious, as in some way or another, Melisandre is already preparing Stannis for what this means, and he seems to be falling in line behind her. In A Storm of Swords, Davos 6, they have this exchange. Stannis ground his teeth again. I never asked for this crown. Gold is cold and heavy on the head, but so long as I am the king, I have a duty. If I must sacrifice one child to the flames to save 1,000,000 from the dark, sacrifice is never easy, Davos, or it is no true sacrifice. Tell him, my lady. Melisandre said, Azor Ahai tempered Lightbringer with the heart's blood of his own beloved wife. If a man with 1,000 cows gives one to God, that is nothing, but a man who offers the only cow he owns. She talks of cows, Davos told the king. I am speaking of a boy, your daughter's friend, your brother's son. Now, Davos repeatedly considers the idea that Edric Storm may be Stannis' version of Nissa Nissa, and that is likely because he doesn't want to think that the most obvious answer is even possible. He probably wouldn't be following Stannis if he thought it was. But on some level, Melisandre and Stannis are likely aware of the fact that if Stannis really is meant to become Azor Ahai reborn, then he must sacrifice Shireen in order to do it. Stannis is a man who seemingly cares for almost no one. He certainly doesn't love his wife, and he doesn't hesitate to cross boundaries like killing his kin-in-law or his own brother in his quest for the throne. There really isn't another person besides Shireen who could possibly even play the role of Stannis' ultimate sacrifice. Now, despite the fact that these narrative connections are pretty obvious once you actually spot them, there is still something very thematically interesting about this fable and the lessons that characters are learning from it, in contrast to what the real moral of the story might be. Because while it is presumed by many that Stannis burning Shireen will be his last resort when he finds himself in dire straits, and while the actual events preceding her death might put him in a position of hopeless desperation, in the minds of Melisandre and Stannis, there was never any other possibility in the end. If Stannis were to become Azor Ahai, he had to sacrifice his Nissa Nissa. And tragically, the person who mattered most to him was also the most innocent. The fascination with the Azor Ahai prophecy is an interesting one, because the importance of this fable probably isn't what it seems. Yes, there are people who believe that this is the key to understanding how the coming apocalypse will be stopped. But Azor Ahai as a mythical figure isn't even introduced into the story until Daenerys, the most likely incarnation of Azor Ahai reborn, has literally already played her role in the story by sacrificing Khal Drogo and bringing 3 superpowered fire weapons into the world in exchange for it. But the dichotomy that George R.R. Martin presents between the person who is likely the prophesied Azor Ahai versus the person who believes that they are, as well as the contrast of who plays the role of their Nissa Nissa, seems telling. Dany fulfills the role of this ancient supposed hero reborn without even realizing it, and she sacrifices the life of an evil man who was ready to terrorize and brutalize the world in her name, in exchange for even more frightening superweapons. But Stannis, a man who knows of this prophecy and believes that he is the only one who can fulfill it, will sacrifice a completely innocent person and damn himself through the most evil act, in exchange for absolutely nothing. The legend of Azor Ahai is undoubtedly an interesting and relevant bit of lore in the world of Ice and Fire. But his importance and the importance of his supposed reincarnation probably isn't what many people think that it's meant to be. And although the sacrifice that he makes with Nissa Nissa presents her as simply a test that he needs to pass in order to gain the kind of power necessary to end the long night, it's really through her role in this fable that we can see the true nature of Azor Ahai's stature as a hero. But what do you think? What is the meaning and purpose of the story of Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.